My name is Natalie MacDonald and I'm Vice President of Strategy and Development at La Trobe University. And I would like to begin this evening by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm delighted to be here this evening for tonight's Ideas in Society event. La Trobe's Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, has been running the Ideas in Society event since 2012. I think we've lost sound there. I'll keep going and we'll see how we go. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Robert, I'd like to thank you for your leadership and for all involved in organising tonight. It takes a great deal of effort and work to bring together events like this, and on behalf of all of us here tonight, we'd like to thank you. German philosopher, diplomat and education reformer Wilhelm von Humboldt described a university as a community of scholars and students engaged in a common search for truth. It's perhaps true to say that over recent years and decades, the debate and search for truth surrounding our climate has been a subject to divide our nation and the world. One former Prime Minister of this country called climate change the greatest moral, economic and social challenge of our time, while another had a whole different view, describing climate change as probably doing good in a speech where he likened policies to combat climate change to primitive people once killing goats to appease the volcano gods. Internationally, the world's largest economy has been as equally polarised as our own in the past, with the Trump administration withdrawing from the Obama administration's Paris targets. But tonight, this is an opportunity to hear from 4 leaders in the climate change debate in Australia, to hear their opinions and ideas, and to hear how they feel society can be brought together to develop a plan to tackle these significant challenges. Tonight's panel also perhaps reflects the changing nature of the debate, with speakers who have been involved in the debate for many, many decades, and others who weren't born when the Kyoto Protocol was signed. We've seen over the past year the youth of today rally significantly around the issue of climate change, with Greta Thunberg leading a global movement to appeal for action on climate change and also dividing public opinion with school strikes. We've got some fabulous speakers lined up tonight, and I will give a short bio of each. Bob Brown is a name synonymous with the environment in Australia, from the fight over Franklin Dam to his recent fight to stop Adani, the convoy. He's been an activist for the environment over many, many decades. He was elected to the Tasmanian State Parliament in 1983 and achieved the expansion of the Tasmanian World Heritage Area. In 1996, Bob was elected to the Senate, where he was part of the national debate on issues like climate change, democracy, preventative healthcare, conservation and human rights. Bob resigned from the Senate in June 2012 to establish the Bob Brown Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation dedicated to supporting action campaigns for the environment in Australia and in our region. David Ritter is a native title lawyer and an academic. He spent 5 years with Greenpeace in the UK, and in 2012 he came back to Australia to head up Greenpeace Australia Pacific, focused on making Greenpeace campaigns as effective as possible. He is a published author, and his most recent book, The Coal Truth, The Fight to Stop Adani, Defeat the Big Polluters and Reclaim Our Democracy, is one you might want to pick up. Dr. Amanda Cahill is the CEO of The Next Economy. Originally trained as an anthropologist, Amanda has spent over 2 decades working on the community development projects across Asia, the Pacific and regional Australia. The focus of her work at The Next Economy is to support communities to develop more resilient, just and sustainable regional economies. Most of this work involves supporting regional communities in Australia to transition away from fossil fuels and towards a zero emissions economy. Amanda has a PhD in Human Geography from the Australian National University and has adjunct positions with the University of Queensland and the University of Sydney. Maiysha Moin is a Year 12 student at Fintona Girls' School. She has gained prominence with her interviews on the Today Show and various media outlets in promotion of the school strikes across Australia. Her passion for climate change and sustainability has manifested in a new initiative, Climate Leaders, and her tenure as Environment Captain at her school. She continues her amazing advocacy with the School Strike for Climate as a Melbourne Strike organiser and spokesperson. Her interests are not limited to environmental activism, but also extend to women's rights and social equality. La Trobe is very committed to action on climate change. We are the Climate Clever University. We have acted by becoming the first university in Australia to commit to divest from the top 200 fossil fuel-based companies, by achieving a 6-star rating against the Green Star community standards for our campuses, by operating a renowned wildlife sanctuary where we engage our students, researchers and community around biodiversity. We're undertaking a 50-year bushland regeneration project on site, and from next year we will commence introducing rare and endangered species back into the sanctuary. We have also committed to the La Trobe Essentials. Since 2014, all undergraduate students at La Trobe have an opportunity to undertake subjects with a commitment to either global citizenship, innovation and entrepreneurship, or sustainability thinking. And last month, we were so proud to announce that we would become the first university in Victoria to achieve net zero emissions within the decade across all campuses, and actually by 2022 at all of our regional sites. We're achieving this by investing $75 million in measures to tackle emissions from our campuses, including an additional 7,000 solar panels over 27 buildings, and that's in addition to the just about 4,000 we already have in place, replacing 50,000 LED lights throughout the university, setting up on-site composting so that no organic waste leaves our site, developing a La Trobe energy analytics platform to better manage energy utilisation across every building, every room, every floor, and working on building a number of solar farms to support the activities in our regions. It's September, we're in Melbourne, so I need to tell you that our solar panels will fill the MCG, if they were in the MCG. We're also currently undertaking work being led by Professor Katie Holmes and Laurie Zion to map our extensive research expertise around climate change. This approach will help us to develop an interdisciplinary approach. We have expertise from science to law to business to history and archaeology, and by bringing all these knowledge disciplines together across teaching and research, we hope that this will aid society's understanding of climate change. La Trobe University seeks not to preach, but to act, to be a climate clever institution, and I hope that Humboldt would agree we are searching for the truth around climate change. I'm so pleased to be here tonight, and I'm now going to hand over to Professor Katie Holmes. Katie is an environmental historian who has worked on the history of gardens and women's writing, and her most recent work is a co-authored book called Mallee Country, Land, People, History, due out shortly, Katie, I believe.
In November.
In November, so there's another one to pick up. Katie is the director for the La Trobe Centre for the Study of the Inland and is leading a significant amount of work, leading a series of academics, multidisciplinary academics, around La Trobe's climate network. Thank you, Katie, and we look forward to an interesting and informative debate.
Thanks very much, Natalie. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you all here this evening. It's wonderful to see that we have a full auditorium, and we are recording this event and it is being live streamed, so that's also very exciting. I'd also like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to recognise that this land has never been and never will be ceded. For the Kulin Nations, this land has also been a meeting place, a place of discussion and ideas, and it's wonderful tonight that we can continue that tradition. And in talking tonight about climate change and in recognising traditional ownership, I'd also like to recognise the 60,000 plus years of custodianship and land management that Indigenous Australians have practiced. Practices that will really, until very recently, have been unrecognised by our settler society. The American philosopher Karl Powers White talks about climate change as being the latest development in the history of colonialism and environmental harm that has been inflicted on the world's Indigenous people. Climate change, he writes, is more like the experience of déjà vu for Indigenous people than the sceptre of a whole new future that those of us who are non-Indigenous are more inclined to evoke. Just to add to the comments that Natalie made in introducing me, I live and work on Wurundjeri country, and I was born right at the very end of the baby boomer generation. So as a white, educated, middle-class woman, I've been part of the generation that has benefited from the dramatic increase in our living standards and in the consumption that this country has seen over my lifetime. An increase, of course, which has been based on a fossil fuel economy and has led to the crisis that we now face. And indeed, I suspect many of us in the room here have benefited from Australia's economic prosperity and thus are implicated in this climate emergency. So I assume that you're here in the hope that our panel will offer some ways to help us think about and also to act on the challenges before us. So for tonight, our panellists will speak for between 10 and 15 minutes. Then we'll have about 20 minutes of moderated panel discussion before opening it to the floor for your questions for approximately 30 minutes. In selecting our panellists for tonight, Professor Robert Mann was very keen that we have leaders that represent different generations of activists. And we've ordered our speakers with that in mind, moving from the father of environmental activism in Australia, Bob Brown, through to one of its most recent warriors in Maiysha Moin. Bob, I'd like you to take the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Well, thank you, Latrobe, and thank you for taking the lead that you are with climate change action. I heard last Thursday new legislation go through the Australian Parliament, opposed by the Greens and Andrew Wilkie, but supported by every other parliamentarian, that prohibits, with penalties from 1 to 4 years, the planning of any invasion of farmlands in Australia for any protest purposes. It also does the same thing in private forests or on fish farms, industrial fish farms. And here we have the face of the ruling plutocracy, that is the wealth, the corporations, working through board governments and big political parties, and indeed independents as well, moving to stem off a much wider protest that is coming down the line from people who see in action on the looming destruction of the biosphere upon which we all depend. But a more insidious invasion has taken place on our farmlands, which has had the corporate sector in the main, as well as the political parties, wholeheartedly supporting the invasion. So that with the Murray-Darling Basin now in places, at least in the worst drought in recorded human history, and some scientists looking at it go back quite some centuries, city of Dubbo, 34,000 people out of water within 8 weeks. Unprecedented, unplanned, unthought about. But as we watch our public and private news channels looking for reasons for this, repeatedly we see this crisis for our nation, which is reflected right around the planet, going without even a mention of the invaders. And the invaders, of course, are the greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere from coal, from burning gas, from burning oil, and from the destruction of forest. And at the time when laws are coming in to say you physically cannot go on to a farm in Australia, or you certainly can't inveigle other people to do that. The case, of course, is for animal rights. This invasion continues. The cost of the drought, on current estimates, will be $12.5 billion. And that money will be taken from schools and hospitals and all other amenities in our society, as if this was something that's not caused, doesn't have a causal entity. And yet we do know what the cause is, and we know it's getting worse. And so we find ourselves in a climate emergency of unprecedented proportions, together with a population of 8 billion. It was 2.5 billion when I came onto the planet in 1944, and a consumptive growth and philosophy of materialism, which go together to present us with the end of life on planet as we know it. Let me quote from the wonderful scientist who represents Australia, amongst others, on the International Panel of Climate Investigators warning the world about what's going on. Joelle Jurgis, who wrote this in the Current Monthly. I quote from her essay: "We know that carbon dioxide concentrations have risen from pre-industrial levels of 280 parts per million to approximately 410 parts per million, the highest recorded in at least 3 million years. Without major mitigation efforts, we are likely to double pre-industrial levels to 560 parts per million by around 2060. That's when children being born at the moment will reach their 40 or 41st birthday. When the IPCC's fifth assessment report was published in 2013, it estimated that such a doubling of carbon dioxide was likely to produce warming up to 4.5 degrees as Earth reaches the new equilibrium. Well, now early reports are predicting, this is the latest reports, that a doubling of carbon dioxide may in fact produce between 2.8 and 5.86 degrees of warming. Incredibly, at least 8 of the latest models produced by leading research centres around the world are showing climate sensitivity of 5 degrees or more. Whereas just a couple of months ago it was predicted that with 6 degrees warming, this is another panel of scientists, all life on Earth will finish. And they're legislating to stop people protesting. Queensland's just legislated. The Queensland Labor government, on the last week of last month, looking at the Wangan and Jagalingou people camped on their land as a protest against the Adani mine, legislated to abolish native title and give that land from under them to Gautam Adani, the Indian billionaire. And the response to this has been almost universal shrug of the shoulders. You know, ladies and gentlemen, history's full of this inertia, this ability to face an oncoming and onrush. We saw it with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It was there with the discussions in the Duma, the Russian parliament, as Lenin stepped off the train in 1917. It was there when Chamberlain flew back to London in 1937, waving peace in our time, a signatured pact with Hitler, and 1 million people danced in the streets in London and the church bells rang 18 months before they were at war. Now the question for all of us is, what are we going to do about this? It's a very testing question. Here are some potential hints besides, I know we're going to all be there on Friday, but it will require millions of people in the streets. It will require millions of us striking, as the children and youngsters will be doing around the world on Friday, in a way that forces our authorities to take notice. 90% of Australians voted for more coal mines, more oil wells, more publicly funded coal seam gas in May this year. What on earth is going on here? How can this be? And as Bertrand Russell said, the problem with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of self-doubt. Well, friends, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody here is intelligent, we've got to get over it, and we've got to get active. I've said that I'd go back up to the Adani site to join the protest there, of those brave people making a stand for this planet, and I will. I've said that I will be back in the Tasmanian forests, the same with the Victorian forests, as what the United Nations says is the best single hedge against climate change is to stop destroying forests. Here we have 5 million people just down off the hills of the greatest carbon hedge on the planet, those great forests of Victoria, while they're felled, doing nothing. And it's not good enough. And we all have to look into our hearts and not wait for somebody else. And this means going down to our local politician's office. Yes, those Labor people destroying those forests and promoting more coal mines, as well as the Liberals and the Nationals and the rest. And sitting there and in very clear terms confronting our politicians and saying, what are you going to do about it? Because I'll vote you out if you don't change what you're doing. It does require funding, tithing our wealth. We are extremely wealthy in Australia, to activist groups like Greenpeace, so that they can raise the level of activity, even as the laws come down in this age of plutocracy, to prevent protest, which might upset the corporate sector, which Abraham Lincoln warned in 1857 would, if not tackled, usurp the throne of democracy, take away our powers. Well, we didn't act on that, and they have overtaken that power, and we need to take it back. And here we are in an extraordinary situation in Australia in 2019, where in the corporate sector are good people taking action for climate change and demanding it of government, while the government does nothing. And our Prime Minister has said he has an action plan on climate change. This is ScoMo. And I'll read you his action plan from the editorial of the Saturday paper this week. And it's this: I pray for that rain everywhere else around the country. He's talking about the drought. And I do pray for that rain, and I would encourage others who believe in the power of prayer to pray for that rain and pray for our farmers too. Please do that. Well, Prime Minister, you are the most powerful person in this country, and there will not be divine intervention. And it is your responsibility to take a lead in this nation to end the process which has brought upon us all, this destructive drought, those bushfires, these increasingly powerfully destructive storms. And what when one like the Bahamas goes through Brisbane, as our scientists are saying, is coming down the line, perhaps in our lifetimes. So it's up to us. We older, wealthier people to fund these young firebrands who have taken up the cudgel. Thank God for Greta. Thank God for the Castlemaine kids. Thank God for those who are going to be there on Friday, backed by us. But we have the money, we have the influence, we have the leadership potential as they grow in strength. And let nobody stand back, be reticent in supporting their action in saving this planet. It is in our hands. The onus is on us. And unlike that meteor or asteroid which crashed into the planet 65 million years ago and sent the dinosaurs to extinction, we can turn ourselves around. We need to share the bounty of this planet. We need to pull in our belts. We need to change governments. We need to ensure that every child on this planet has an education. And above all, we need to put an end to the burning of fossil fuels, not in 2030, not in 2050, but now. 5 times the action that we're taking now is required if we're going to stop this onrushing disaster in its tracks. We did that in World War I. We did that in World War II. We can do it in 2019. But it's going to take a rebellion of the people. And we'll see something of that rebellion on Friday. With our young is our hope. But with our established people, ourselves, is this call for us to take the leadership, the power, use the money, use the influence that we have, because the earth depends upon it. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
Good luck. Thank you, Bob, for that passionate call to arms and to action. David, thank you. David Ritter.
Yes, what he said. So the question that was served up tonight was to talk about what now for the climate movement. Like Bob, though, I think actually the question is more what now for the government. But in framing this question, I want to go back to a recent night that probably looms quite large in the minds of most of those here, and that is the night of the 20th of May. Now, I was at home with my partner and our 2 daughters and some of our best mates and their kids, and we'd all had democracy sausage, of course, but, you know, that wasn't enough, so we ordered in some local pizza and we sat round to experience the count. And look, I think it's fair to say it was a mixed night. On the upside, the pizza was excellent. And while it's not quite as joyful as teaching your kids how to fly a kite or swim or ride a bike, there's no doubt that it's really important and it is memorable teaching your kids about the functioning of democracy. It's not always entirely easy to explain, but it's important and it is memorable. But there was the downside as well. The Morrison government was returned without a shred of credible climate or energy policy to its name. Now, my eldest daughter is only 10, but her verdict on the night was clear. Dad, she said, this is a little bit scary. And she was right. And the result was scary because, as we've already heard, the climate emergency is upon us. The severe climate damage is already affecting our country. The storms are ripping us up. The fires are burning us. The drought is unprecedented. There are ecological disasters, and there is worse to come. Now, so far, Scott Morrison's government has shown a complete disdain for the wise counsel and warnings of experts and scientists and emergency workers. Last week, though, confirmation of the seriousness of the climate emergency came from a source that I am hopeful they may be more likely to heed. I speak, of course, of none other than Australia's greatest Test wicket taker, Shane Warne. Am I wrong to hope that maybe ScoMo will listen to Warnie? So in case you missed it, Shane Warne described the climate emergency as humanity's most pressing challenge and said, rightly, that it would be wrong to just put your head in the sand. Now, the thing that I think is really significant about this is Shane Warne is making these statements once he has been confronted with the reality of what climate means for his former workplace, the cricket pitch. And in that sense, Warnie is speaking for every farmer, for every parent, for every emergency worker, for every business owner, for every child, for every quiet Australian, for every pet, for every farm animal, every coral reef, every river, every rainforest, and everyone and everything else that faces the impacts of the climate emergency in their real world, in their jobs, in their homes, in their ecosystems. This is the physical reality. Yet the Morrison government's response to this physical reality is worse than negligent. They have no credible mechanism for reducing the emissions that are driving the climate emergency. They have no plan at all for phasing out coal, which is Australia's biggest driver of the climate emergency. Worse still, Morrison and co are actively looking for ways to increase subsidies for propping up big coal. And let's remember, coal doesn't just pollute our climate, it also pollutes more directly through air pollution for pollution into our waters. It directly damages our health. According to one study, 279 people die early every year as a consequence of coal-related air pollution. And you've got to ask yourself, just in a straight-out technological sense, why are we even having this conversation? Surely the age of the dangerous, polluting, old coal-fired power stations is over. I mean, who among us continues to defend the use of a bucket under the bed rather than a flushing toilet? Who among us says, oh yes, the dial-up modems, they are infinitely preferable to fast-speed internet? Why is there even any argument about getting rid of dirty, polluting, out-of-date and unreliable coal and replacing it with clean energy, particularly now that renewables are cheaper as new build than fossil fuels? So in summary, the first duty of government is the security of our citizens. And in the context of the climate emergency, our politicians are failing dismally to discharge that duty. So as my eldest said, yep, it is indeed a little bit scary. But as Raymond Williams once said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And the truth is that great change is non-linear and history is unpredictable. Since the election, we have seen an incredible and unprecedented surge in climate activism in our country. We have seen it across all sectors and all geographies of our national community. These are people who are standing up and determined to make hope possible. In Rebecca Solnit's phrase, this is hope in the dark. Now, speaking from purely a Greenpeace perspective, we have experienced an unparalleled rush in people wanting to get involved. New people, tens of thousands signing up online, hundreds signing up for trainings all over the country, more than 40 new local groups in the 100 days after Morrison was re-elected. All over Australia, communities are organising anew to demand the early closure of dirty, polluting coal-fired power stations. But of course, the phenomenon is wider than Greenpeace. The surge in support for the school strikers on climate is fantastic. Parents, carers, community members, my own email is full of parents at our local school working out who's going to take whom and who's going to be responsible for getting which kids there. preparing to march in solidarity on Friday and beyond. And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to Maiysha, to acknowledge you and all of the leaders of the school strikers. You are providing so much leadership, inspiration and momentum. And I want to say to you, Greenpeace stands with you and we will be marching with you on Friday.
Thank you.
In locations all over Australia, in towns and cities, we are seeing the declaration of climate emergencies. Now, before the federal election, only a few local councils had come out and said it was a climate emergency, but since that election night, the number has soared to almost 50 municipal authorities, together representing almost 5 million Australians. Now, let's not ignore that this is a particular Australian innovation. The climate emergency is a moment of great Australian political leadership through action that may one day be spoken of in the same breath as our other great contributions to global democracy, including the living wage, the secret ballot and voting rights for women. Thank you to Darebin Council, the birthplace of the Climate Emergency Declaration, a step that has now been followed by more than 1,000 jurisdictions in 19 countries around the world, representing hundreds of millions of people. All of this goes to show that Morrison's coalition government and the nation of Australia are not one and the same thing. The government is not the country, and the country is not waiting for the government. Huge amounts of climate action can and is occurring outside of what the Commonwealth Government does or rather does not do. Cities, towns, states, territories, businesses, institutions of all kinds are taking action and can do so much more. Elections come, elections go, but we must retain belief in what is possible and execute our best plans to make it so. And we are doing this because from where we stand today, Australia can still have a flourishing future. The need for leadership has never been greater. But if our politicians won't stand up and do their job, then it is up to the rest of us. Together we can do this. Together we must do this. Together we will do this. And we will do it out of love and respect for our land and for our kids, and with all of the creativity and all of the bravery that we can muster to build a new Australia together. The climate movement is determined that Australia shall have a flourishing future. But let me go back to the original question. What now for the government? So I say to Scott Morrison and his government, and to all of the politicians in Canberra, if you have neither the wit nor the courage to lead, then at least have the wisdom and the decency to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Amanda.
Good evening, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on has never been ceded. Acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As was mentioned earlier, I run an organisation called The Next Economy based in Brisbane. And for the last 5 years, most of this work has been across Australia, from Townsville in the north to Latrobe Valley down here, and even stretching across Australia to South Australia and WA. I had a conversation with people in WA the other day about how do we take on this challenge of transitioning our economy from one that's based on fossil fuels to a zero emissions economy? And how do we do it in a way that we bring everyone along with us? What are the economic opportunities? What do the jobs actually look like? So on the ground, what this work looks like is bringing together business leaders, local government, state government, federal government, people from small business, Chamber of Commerce, environment groups, community groups, pretty much everyone across the board into either roundtable discussions to go, what's actually happening here and what can we do about it? Community forums to raise awareness, or training with groups on the ground who are saying, we want to start a conversation and we don't know how. And for that 5-year period, I've been waiting for the town that's going to run me out of town, that's going to brand me a greenie and go, get out of here, we don't want to talk to you. But I've actually found the opposite. When we sit around and have this conversation, even the most conservative people, when they actually look at what's already happening to reduce and absorb emissions across different sectors in their own place, go, oh, it's already happening. Okay, well that makes sense. Why isn't anyone else talking about this? Because there is so much happening around Australia, and it's happening by and being led by some of the most unlikely suspects. But then earlier this year, something changed. We were running a forum up in Townsville a few weeks before the election, and I sent out the notice about the forum to the normal people who promote it for me, people who are responsible for economic development and planning in the region. And I got 3 separate emails back from women who I knew supported the work and had actually been using the work to do what they're doing in regional economic development. They said, I'm really sorry, you know that we love the work, I know that what you're talking about isn't political, but I'm sorry I can't promote your forum. I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. And I'd really like to come, but maybe next time. So at this time, when the need for meaningful climate action is so urgent, I'm going to take a bit of a different tack and pose a potentially controversial question. What if we're going about this the wrong way? What if, instead of seeing the climate as a problem to fix, or to fight to the death with coal and gas industries, what if we actually looked at climate change as a gift of clarity and a gift of feedback about where we've been going wrong as a society, and a sign pointing to where we can do so much better, economically, socially and politically? What if we look past the obvious and immediate issue that there are too many and too much greenhouse gas in our atmosphere to recognise the real cause of climate change? That is, an economic system that's based on extraction, not only at the expense of the environment, but also of so many people for the benefit of the few. Because the polarisation and the anger and the fear that we're seeing in regional areas, but not just regional areas, is not simply about coal or gas or energy. It's the product of a growing rift in our country that's been exacerbated by 25 years of neoliberal policies that have seen services ripped from communities, increasing extraction of wealth for people in other places somewhere else, growing inequality, increasing insecure work conditions, the dismantling of our welfare system, while the cost of living keeps on increasing. This isn't about coal. This is about the economy, democracy and justice. The disruption of climate change presents us with a unique moment in history where we can choose to do things differently, to transform our systems to not only make sure that no one's left behind, but actually that we could all be better off in the long run. There are so many practical examples I want to give you, but in the time I've got, I'm just going to focus on 5. What does this look like? Well, first, let's start by recognising the first peoples of Australia. People with the knowledge and wisdom that saw them through multiple ice ages and other dramatic climatic changes through their long occupation on this continent. People who have been on the front lines of climate impacts, but also the front lines of extraction and resistance. How do we recognise, in a practical and a financial way, the ongoing services that Indigenous groups provide in the way of sequestering carbon, protecting our soils and waterways, and reducing emissions through proper land management? How can remote communities benefit from owning their own renewable energy systems and getting off diesel? Second, let's join in solidarity with workers in the fossil fuel industry to manage this transition with respect and dignity, to show gratitude for the contribution they've made to the prosperity of this nation by supporting them to transition to new jobs, good jobs. How do we get to a place where we can boast, like Germany can at the moment, that we can when we close the last coal mine or plant, that not one worker has been forced into redundancy and that everyone who wants a job has a job? Third, let's recognise the many households that are struggling to make ends meet as work becomes increasingly precarious and the costs continue to rise, leaving nearly 1 in 5 households in Australia food insecure. Let's take on the challenge of preparing households for climate impacts in a way that everybody's resilient, starting with making sure that everyone has the access to basics that we all need as a fundamental human right: food, water, housing, energy, connectivity, transport, health and education. These are not a given everywhere in Australia. Next, let's make sure that while we're building the new energy systems, we don't, in our haste, replace one extractive system with another. Because we can get to 100% renewable energy very quickly through private companies building large-scale renewable systems across the country. And they'll do it the same way, extracting profits without necessarily putting anything back into regenerating communities and the environment. We could do this differently. We can take back public control of our utilities and actually see electricity as a public service, and that's what the unions are advocating for. Or we could take advantage of the decentralised nature of the technology to support community-owned renewable energy that builds capacity, wealth and democracy in our local communities. And finally, now is the time to ask how we can build on the tide of public discontent to reinvent democracy in this country, to find ways for people to participate in meaningful and effective ways, to create new spaces for dialogue, and to, more importantly, to start listening more and to meet and understand each other where we're at face to face. Because I know from my travels across this country that there are unlikely leaders everywhere who want to be part of the solution, and we're not hearing from them right now. So many of them don't identify with the climate movement, and maybe they don't have to. But we do need to find better ways to support them, to make it safe for them to stand up and to arm them with the practical solutions, confidence and skills that they need to do what they can in their own spheres of influence, whether that's in their industry, their workplace, within government, within schools, within community groups, or even just within their household. Because now is the time. Our nation has been shaken to its core, and people everywhere are crying out for answers, for understanding and for connection. It's up to us to meet that call and to appeal to the very best of who we are as Australians. That challenge is immense, but we have everything that we need to meet that challenge and to create new systems that place well-being of everyone at their core. Thank you.
Maiysha, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on whose land we meet today, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. We are using a 19th century form of electricity generation in the 21st century. We are using a form of technology which is 2 centuries out of date. In an era where having an iPhone just a couple of generations past is socially unacceptable, or having a Nokia brick phone is social condemnation, it's unfathomable how we've continued to power our world with coal and fossil fuels. We are overdue for new technology befitting for the 21st century. Tonight we've heard from spirited and intelligent speakers, all of whom have been involved in the politics of climate change for several years. But we're missing a voice. The voice of the future generations. Us. We're the generation who will be impacted the most by the decisions made today, whether they be wise or foolish. The most terrifying and helpless part of this is that our lives are in your hands. A great number of us cannot vote, and at the federal election this year, we were silenced by the older generations who will ultimately not live long enough to suffer the consequences of climate inaction. Time is our antagonist. The dreary duration of a decade and a bit of education has prevented us from shaping the decisions in the worlds of business, politics, engineering, media, education, and science. The bleak reality is that we'll never get there if we don't act now. The time for us to step into the roles of leadership in these realms does not exist. There are only a few grains of sand left in the hourglass. That's why we're taken to the streets to take back time, to take back people power. We're striking from school, from university, from work, to bring the climate crisis to the forefront of Australian and international politics. We are pleading with our politicians to move past toxic, partisan politics and find durable solutions to the greatest threat to humanity and human civilization. Tonight, I can rattle off the numbers, drench you in the fear of the desolate future to come. But you know, by the end of the century, we could be up to 6 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. You know that we are going through the 6th mass extinction with up to 200 species going extinct every single day. You know that Dubbo in New South Wales will hit day 0 this November due to a drought exacerbated by climate change, and that vulnerable Australian communities, including our farmers, First Nations people, and workers in the fossil fuel industry, will bear the brunt of climate inaction. You know that at this rate, by 2030, Australia's exports and domestic emissions will account for 4.8% of world emissions. So much for 1% not making a difference. These predictions make our blood run cold, but they don't even account for nature's feedback loops or the forecasted climate apartheid. The world will suffer 6 2008-style financial crises if we don't act in time. Greta Thunberg is right. Our house is on fire and we must panic. Amidst the panic, we have hope. It's like when you procrastinate for days, postponing that essay that's due, and submit it just hours before the deadline, under a maelstrom of anxiety and fear for your grades. You are able to create a magnificent piece. Don't tell my teachers I do that. The parallels between science and the human condition is outstanding. Diamonds are made under pressure. So are essays by the looks of it. Let's take a similar train of thought. Right now, with only a decade left before we reach tipping point, we should be using panic as a fuel to pursue solutions to combat the climate crisis. After the election of the coalition back into Parliament with no credible climate policy and our PM acting as a national embarrassment by remaining suspiciously absent from the UN Emergency Climate Summit in New York this September, it's time we, the people, take action. What else are we supposed to expect from a Prime Minister who declares his undying love for coal in Parliament? Honestly, even Twilight is a better love story. School Strike for Climate has 3 key demands. 1, say no to new coal, oil and gas projects, including the Adani coal mine. 2, powering Australia with 100% renewable energy by 2030. 3, funding a just transition and job creation for all fossil fuel workers and their communities. While these demands can be met by public policy, we need to look at solutions beyond Canberra. I believe there are 3 layers to democratic climate action, all of which are interconnected: business, science, and people power. During the federal election, we watched as seats near the Adani coal mine fall to the coalition, and I realised we have been preaching to the converted for too long. It's time we include Queenslanders and those who see climate change as irrelevant into the conversation. It's time to speak economics, money and jobs to underscore the systemic crisis which climate change will engender. For a number of Queenslanders, their priority is securing a job which will support their livelihood and their families. If we step into their shoes, we can see that putting food on the table the next night is much more important than the complicated predictions of extreme weather systems. So, how do we encourage them to extend their myopic vision to one that encompasses the consequences of climate inaction? Jobs. Some Australians feel as though pursuing climate action is equivalent to job instability in the fossil fuel industry, which is why School Strike for Climate added a new demand, calling for funding for a just transition. At a political level, we need a jobs promise or guarantee, which secures a transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry into either renewables or retraining into another industry, with equal or higher pay. In addition, to support families, the government must consider a youth guarantee, which will see young people from mining communities secure a job after their tertiary studies or apprenticeship. Like Germany, the government needs to collaborate with unions and business figures to ensure justice for all workers and their communities. We can already see faint traces of this with Star of the Sea, an offshore wind project in Gippsland. Businesses must be a key driver for 100% renewables by 2030. Global trends in investment in fossil fuel have tumbled in the past 3 years, while renewables, as you can expect, have boomed. Investors need to not only propel the renewables industry, but also consider how their investments will shape Australia's GDP. We live in a capitalist society. We can't deconstruct that system right now, but we can play it. Adani is being supported by the federal and state governments because purportedly they can bring in revenue for Australia through coal exports. What do renewables have to offer which can supersede coal and LNG exports? Well, Wesfarmers have sold their last coal asset, win, now investing into the lithium industry to supply lithium hydroxide to Tesla for electric cars. There we go, materials for electric cars. And if we broaden our horizons, what we see is a myriad of opportunities. Battery storage exports, electric car exports, renewable infrastructure exports, the list goes on. Investors have a soft power within our society, and they must use it to play a role in the future of the decarbonisation of our economy. We have unions attending the strike on Friday and pressing for action, but we need all businesses too. By intersecting business with climate energy, we can ensure a secure transition for all workers and continued GDP growth for Australia. The second solution lies in science. Surprise, surprise. As I opened, I noted that we are using a 19th century form of electrical power generation in the 21st century. From the 19th and 20th century, technology has developed exponentially. And it's time we harness our advancements in science to protect our planet. In VCE chemistry, we study fuels and investigate various forms of modern technology in replacing current forms of energy production. Coal-fired power plants are 30 to 40% efficient, which is an issue from both a business and scientific outlook. However, strides in scientific research have given rise to new solutions such as biofuels and fuel cells. Biofuels can be in the form of biogas, which is excellent for rural farming communities who can utilise the methane from animal and plant waste, or biodiesel, which can be produced from plant oils. Fuel cells are my favourite though. As you can tell, I really love chemistry. This incredible form of technology can be up to 90% efficient. That's more than double that of coal power, with the added bonus of being both quiet and clean. The minor issue is that fuel cells require a constant supply of reactants, hydrogen and oxygen gas. What we need in this field is greater research into hydrogen production and storage and investment into the technology itself. As you can see, the intersection between the business and science world is vital to combating climate change. Also, please note that everything I've told you about these new fuel alternatives is actually from my Year 12 VCE course. And this is the power of education, finding solutions. Finally, I want to touch on people power. This Friday, September 20th, we are going on strike. We are taking part in our democracy and we are learning what it means to be an active citizen. History has shown us that collective action from the people engenders change. From the Vietnam War moratoriums to the recent protests in Hong Kong. But democratic action doesn't just stop at strikes. Talk to your local MP about your concerns about climate change and propose how they too can take action in Parliament, ideally by collaborating and compromising with other political parties. Recently, I met with Jed Carney, the member for Cooper, and convinced her to speak with Susan Ley, the Minister for Environment, about how the Labor and Liberal parties can work together in a bipartisan fashion on climate action. Has she done this? Not too sure. I guess I'll have to check in. Beyond politics, tap into the communities you belong to instigate conversation around climate, whether that's your sporting team, your union, or your weekend yoga class. Set up a trivia night at your local pub to chat about Australia's current stance on emissions and what you too can do about it, from tree plantings to switching to clean energy companies. You might just discover a tycoon or a climate scientist amongst you. And most importantly, make your actions count. It can be as active as joining an environment group or a political party, or simply being conscious of how your money acts as your vote. Climate change is the greatest social, economic, and moral challenge of this century. And for young people, it's swallowing up our whole future. Our lives are in your hands, and the solutions are right before you. We are a train heading full speed into a catastrophe, and you, the adults, have the power to pull the brakes. So join us Friday, September 20th, to fight for our one and only planet. Climate denialism and inaction, in the words of Bob Hawke, is an environmental obscenity and an economic absurdity. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll all agree with me that the school strikers are in very good hands. Maiysha, thank you very much. And thank you to all our panel. We've had some challenging and kind of demanding talks, I think, and some interesting call to arms and other ways of coming at this problem. I'd like to think about, perhaps open up the discussion now and begin with this question of activism. You are all activists in different ways, and it's one of the things that unites you, but it's also interesting to think about the differences. And I was struck, some of you may have read Tim Flannery this morning in The Conversation and then in the ABC News website. And I quote him, "No climate report or warning, no political agreement or technological innovation has altered the ever upward trajectory of carbon dioxide pollution. This simple fact forces me to look back on my 20 years of climate activism as a colossal failure." Now, Tim Flannery, as most of you will know, is one of our leading climate scientists. He's made an extraordinary contribution to our understanding of climate change and led the way in so many ways. I think his lament here registers a really powerful generational shift, and he's calling for his generation of climate activists to really reevaluate their climate strategy. So is it time for a radical change of tactics? And I open that to all of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Bob.
Well, as I outlined, it's no good lamenting the failure that we have. What we have to do is confront how we're going to change this in the future. And I'm afraid it's a settled society debating it is not going to make that change. During the Franklin River campaign, which so many Melbourne activists supported and helped win back nearly 40 years ago now, it looked completely hopeless. And when the bulldozers rolled into the valley, the game was up. And people said to me, Bob, you've got to give this up. You're just simply leading people into a depressive self-defiance of something that's inevitably going to happen. And 18 months later, it was saved. Because people did go into the forests against the law, but for the laws of nature, standing for the law of common sense. And they risked their reputation, they risked their jobs, they went to jail, and that led a nation to say, we're not going to stand with this, and changed the government back in those days. But the Franklin still runs free to the sea, creating jobs, creating delight, one of the world's great whitewater rafting adventures. What we have now before us, though, is a Franklin dilemma of global significance. And I'm afraid that simply calling for change, well, as Machiavelli said 600 years ago, if you want to change the world, get ready to be crushed by those who've got the money and the power. And we've got to be ready to be crushed by those who've got the money and the power and defy it. And Friday's going to be a great statement to governments and to business around this nation, but the time is going to come, has come, where we simply need to go beyond that. We need to risk our money, we need to risk our feeling of reputation, we need to risk our equanimity, we need to step out of the footpath onto the roadway and stop the traffic of the current commerce and business as it is, because otherwise it will keep going. And that's a challenge to each of us as to how we're going to do that. Tim is right. 2 decades of activism hasn't worked because the activism has been too passive. It's got to become much more active. I'm opposed to any violence here, but there's a long way to go in peaceful activism that we have not, a long road of it that we haven't challenged. And the time is on us now to take up that challenge. And for all those folk who've gone up to join FLAC and the people getting in the way of the mining and the rail works up there, I take my hat off to them. I think they are great global citizens, putting themselves in the way for the planet of the future. And, that's a challenge to all of us. Are we going to emulate that?
Amanda, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, more of that, but we have been missing something. And I think it's been really interesting. I had a chat to Bob on Sunday about this. Since the election, I've been asked to do a lot of talks because a lot of what I do doesn't look like change work. It's regional economic development work. And I'm working up in Townsville and places where the convoy didn't go down so well with locals. And so a lot of people, when I speak, I always get the question. It's like, oh, that terrible convoy. You must be really annoyed at them. And I was like, well, no, I actually need them to create the pressure and the space that then makes people scratch their heads and go, ooh, something's happening here. Maybe we need to figure that out. And I think that piece of what we're saying yes to, not just what we're saying no to, has been missing from the discussion. So people are feeling like they have to pick a side, which is, yes, let's fight for climate change and get rid of fossil fuels, but in people's heads, they don't have a vision of what that actually looks like for our lives in the future. And so I think we need to do a lot more work in working with people to go, this is what it looks like. This is what it's going to look like for your life. This is what it's going to look like for your sector, for the jobs. And we can do this. We actually have all the technology. There are examples all around the world where we're doing things differently across agriculture and transport and waste and construction. And they're really inspiring stories, but we haven't been talking enough about that. So we need to create that pressure, but we also need to tell a very different story and get people on board with that so they can see that they have a future and that they can be part of that and not just feel like black or white. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment?
Oh, wow. Okay, sure. I really do agree with Amanda. I think with a lot of communities, especially up in Queensland, where their first priority is jobs and their families, we've got to bring them into the conversation and see how they're going to play a role. You know, a lot of people have this misconception that with renewables, they're not going to have stable jobs. Firstly, myth bust that. And secondly, how can they be part of the decision making? The moment you put the power into people's hands, they feel as though, okay, I'm responsible for it now. I can choose what I want to do. And ultimately, they will naturally go toward choices like renewables and clean energy because that's cheaper and it makes sense economically, but also because they'll realise they have the power to dictate the future of their children, and every parent wants the best for their kids.
David, I'm wondering, in relation to the question about the different stories that, or the stories that we're not hearing, the vision that's not being articulated. Greenpeace has played a strong role in trying to articulate, certainly identify where the challenge needs to be pushed. Do we need to be telling a different kind of story, though? Do we need to be challenging in different ways and painting a different vision?
Well, look, I mean, I fell in love with Greenpeace really when I was a kid, actually. I had a picture of the Rainbow Warrior on my wall. I also had a picture of Alan Border and a picture of Blondie on my wall, and I didn't become a rock star or cricketer, so there was no predestination in it. But the thing that appealed to me, even in the dark days of being a lawyer, was actually the idea in the name, that the name was not a foundation of this or a project of that or but Greenpeace. It was a vision of how the world might be, and it was a vision that actually was based on a sort of idea of love, agape, a sort of idea of love for the stranger and love for the nature. It wasn't an extractive view of the world, and it's an astonishing legacy to be part of, and it's by no means a legacy that's exclusive to Greenpeace, but it's that expression of our humanity that is something deeper than the political slanging match, that is deeper than the idea that all we stand for is our use value or what we are, in a commercial sense. And I think as we look forward, we can envisage a very different kind of Australia. Australia remade as the best version of us, to quote Australia Remade, which is a vision that both Amanda and I have had a little bit to do with pushing for. And it's a vision that speaks to the best of us. It's a vision that speaks to community and speaks to the things that you think of when you first wake up in the morning on your best days. And that speaks to that idea of a deep future where actually our school kids aren't having to turn out to fight for a decent pathway, but can be secure in the knowledge that actually we're on a good path here. And I think we can afford to be more optimistic than Tim was in that piece this morning. I mean, Tim's a scientist. I mean, the thing about scientists is they want everything to look like an experiment. It's a pass or a fail. My hypothesis is that activism hasn't worked, and look, the results show that history isn't like that. History is non-linear. History is unpredictable. We never know when the moments of great progress are going to come. No one predicted that just years after the death camps were closed, we would see the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the establishment of the National Health Service in England. History doesn't work in that kind of linear way.
Can I just say that David did an undergraduate degree and almost finished a PhD in history.
I didn't.
A man after my own heart. So we need more history, we need more stories, we need more vision. Amanda and Maiysha, you've both also though talked about thinking about economics in a different way and thinking about involving businesses in much more actively in this new future that you're talking about. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that, because it does seem to me one of the interesting things that we've also heard is that in the failure of our political leadership, what we're seeing is businesses stepping into the breach. And when the CEO of BHP, Andrew Mackenzie, comes out and talks about, you know, the existential threat of climate change, something's shifting. Are there risks, though, in looking to business for leadership?
Yeah, I think so. The first thing that comes to mind is, I think we keep talking about the future, whereas actually one of the most powerful things that keeps giving me hope is at a regional level, getting people in the room and getting them to map out, like literally list, how are you reducing and absorbing emissions across every sector? And so where businesses are already doing that, and they're doing it not necessarily for climate reasons, but for cost reasons. Like one of the biggest solar farms in North Queensland was built by Sun Metals as a metal refinery because the cost of electricity was too high. But the interesting thing is by actually getting people to see what's happening, it shifts this overwhelming sense of victimhood that I'm seeing everywhere in Australia. I used to work in international development. The reason I came back to Australia was because I did a talk in North Queensland and afterwards got asked to go back and met with 54 people in 5 days, and it was this sense of powerlessness that people had. Now, compared to Fiji, Timor-Leste, Philippines, Sri Lanka, other places I've worked, I'm like, we have no excuse in this country. We have the expertise, the money, the resources, the people who know how to do this. So we need to shift that by mapping out what is already happening by lots of different actors. But the other thing is, in opening up this conversation, it has really surprised me how quickly the conversation becomes quite radical. So people start asking questions like, actually, we used to be more resilient. We used to have more services here. You actually used to be able to run a household on one wage. So even conservative people are starting to ask radical questions about what happened to our economy. How did we end up here? How have things become so centralised? And I think that's the way in to have a conversation about the economy, saying, okay, we've got some challenges ahead. In your place, how are you going to set up the systems that you're going to need so that everyone's livelihood is assured? What does that actually look like here, and what are you already doing to do that? And people are talking about cooperatives. So cooperatives all over Australia popping up. There's a resurgence of that. There's the community-owned renewables. So it isn't just business as usual. Something really interesting is happening here, and there's new forms of community finance where communities are just getting on with it. So I want to make that visible, because that is where we can experiment and create new systems that actually tackle the underlying cause of climate change in the first place.
Maiysha, would you like to pick up on that intersection between business and the role of business perhaps in this whole area?
Amanda's very right in speaking about regional communities and them playing a huge role in climate action. One of the things I've noticed as a young person and also as part of the environment movement is that quite a number of people, as you can expect, are quite left-leaning, and that's absolutely fine. But I've got friends who are part of quite a number of different political parties, from the Greens to Labor to the Liberal Party as well, and they're all part of climate action. The question then becomes, branched. There are two kinds of people now. There are people who fight for the future, for kids, I guess the more human aspects of this debate. And then there are people who talk about the economics. They talk about the numbers. And, both are perfectly valid. And today when I was talking, I wanted to touch on both because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are creating numbers. We're the ones who've created a system which is ultimately failing us. So we've got to talk about both of these kinds of people. Coming back to economics and business, ultimately what we're seeing is our government is failing young people, it's failing you, and ultimately a lot of this is going to fall on businesses because the thing is we are a capitalist society. We can't change that overnight as much as we want to. As much as we want people to love each other, it's not going to happen.
It already is happening. I think there's a change. Sorry.
No. There is a change.
Yeah.
Yes, there is a change, but it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And what we need to do is ensure that we put as much momentum behind this change and also ensure that all businesses are getting behind it because they play a crucial role in the foundations of who we are.
No, go on.
I do want to acknowledge the risk though, because I think there is a concentration of wealth in the baby boomer generation. And there's been a number of times I've been in conversations with, sorry to stereotype, but older white men with a lot of money who... You guys started the generational thing, right? You asked to talk from a generational perspective. And there's a different worldview, like that even people who are starting to invest their money in something different are also hedging their bets. And they don't want to give away that power and money, for all sorts of reasons. But there's also the sense that I've had a few people say, yeah, but don't worry, the technology will sort it out. There'll be a new technology. And that's what worries me about the nuclear debate, even though it makes no sense at all from a practical, it's expensive, it takes a long time, it's a bad idea. Okay, everyone got that? But it keeps coming up because people go, there's a certain generation around that, and people can capture that and they can make a lot of money out of it when there's high-tech solutions. So that's where I worry about business, because yes, we can have hydrogen. You can make hydrogen from coal-fired electricity, or you can make it from renewable energy electricity. Now, if people are wanting to keep the coal industry going, they can promote hydrogen that way. So it's not a given that everything's going in one direction. We need to keep the pressure on them and show them that they can do it a different way, and they have to do it a different way for social licence. What we've got in our favour, insurance companies are putting the pressure on, there's financial risk and there's legal risk. And behind closed doors, energy companies are starting to worry about that, and they're starting to plan. That's where we need to be focused.
David, did you want to comment on that?
Just very quickly on business. So there's no business plan robust enough to survive a 4-degree world, right? I mean, they simply run into the wall. And I think the time has come for businesses that aren't themselves fossil fuel companies to just get off the fence. And there's a very easy mantra for doing that. It's don't buy, don't supply, say why. So don't buy dirty electricity from fossil fuel industry, from fossil fuel producers, and then don't supply your services to fossil fuel companies. It's no good having a nice green sustainability policy if you've got your oil and gas department that's selling services to the oil and gas industry or the coal industry or whatever it might be. So don't buy, don't supply. And then the say why is just really important to come out and say, well, as a decent business that takes an ethical view and a long-term view on profit, that's why we're not buying the stuff and we're not selling to them anymore. It worked in terms of the great campaign to deal with apartheid South Africa, and as Desmond Tutu said many years ago now, we need that kind of frame for dealing with the fossil fuel industry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bob, do you see the business world as part of the plutocracy that you talk about, or is it part of the solution?
No, it's the driving force of the plutocracy, and you see cracks in it now, but we are in a democracy where the government's job is to control the marketplace, which is free enterprise. but the marketplace has bought government and the big parties. And, you know, one thing we're missing and needs to be stated about the Adani mine, it's not going to produce an electron in Australia. That coal is going to be exported to India, where renewable energy is already cheaper than coal, but it's going to be put into a power station where the local people have been evicted, and the Prime Minister, who's a friend of Adani, is making it a tax haven. In other words, the taxpayers are going to subsidise the burning of that coal and the further destruction of our coral reefs and everything, and the increase in droughts. It is immoral. It's bankrupt. Under the laws of nature, it's criminal, and it's occurring in our country. And we've got state and federal governments backing it to the hilt and displacing our own Indigenous people to allow it to happen. And the outrage of that situation in 2019 in Australia has been met largely with apathy. And we have to change that, ladies and gentlemen. We've got to get moving on it because this should not be happening in Australia in 2019. H.G. Wells said that history is a race between education and disaster. Well, we're educated and we're allowing the disaster to occur because we are very well off and we're very comfortable. And I'm afraid we have to be discomforted. We have to take risks. And this government didn't get there by some sort of subterfuge. It got there by the voters. And that brings me, of course, to the Murdoch media, the hate media, which is no longer a purveyor of the news, but it's a purveyor of plutocracy and the interest of plutocracy, and it needs to be taken on. I took it on in the Senate. I'll continue to take it on. It means I don't get a good press with Mr. Murdoch, but it does also mean he will never go into a debate with me or anybody like me in front of a public audience in Australia. He sold out his citizenship. He went and became a foreign national to increase his empire, yet has more say over what our politicians think than anybody else in this country. And we need to stand up to that. And so, you know, whether it's the Herald Sun or the Australian just a couple of weeks ago saying that the Great Barrier Reef's fine, it's okay, big picture. You know, the Courier Mail in Brisbane saying that the black-throated finch threatened with extinction by this Adani mine, its only hope of survival is if the mine is built. Now that's a page 2 news story by a deputy editor of the Courier Mail. And they have taken over. They've usurped and corrupted the honest, fair press telling the truth that we used to delight in. But we need to stand up to it, and they need to be taken on as well. And I think the media is greatly challenged by the circumstances. And hats off to The Guardian and other organs which do at least print how the greenhouse gas rate is increasing in the atmosphere, and have given a lot of coverage to what's happening on this beautiful, fantastic, unique, singular little planet that we are the guardians of, and are urged to take action to ensure that it survives into the future of our kith and kin and our fellow creatures.
I'm glad you addressed the media question because it was my next one. We now it's time to open to the audience for questions. We have mics, and I'd ask you to wait until you have the mic in your hand before you begin to ask your question, because we are recording, and that way we can capture your question. Please keep your questions brief. So hands up those with questions, one down here, all over the place. Ooh.
Hi, my name's David. Can you hear me? Yep. My name's David, and I'm a student scientist and also work full-time in risk management. I've changed my view on nuclear over the course of the climate debate, and I really want you to look back at maybe by stopping nuclear, we locked ourselves into this high carbon polluting economy that's producing a huge amount of greenhouse gases. Is it time now to look to the future of new nuclear technologies for the 21st century nuclear, not the 20th century nuclear, and look at what those technologies could perhaps bring as a solution, but also how they could replace some of the jobs from Queensland with new mining jobs that will give those people their security in their future?
Amanda, you
already said
took
my
on the
piece.
nuclear piece. Do you want to expand on your
I
comments?
guess my question is why? Like, when we know that we can have 100% renewable energy powering this country with storage solutions, with the right mix. Now, that's not a personal opinion. There have been, I think the last time I counted, which was a few years ago, about 12 university studies that I knew of that were showing we could get to 100% renewable energy in as fast as 10 years, power the economy and make that work. So why would we be looking at something that's expensive, that still has risks attached, that's not just, even if you can manage the waste issues, which some people are telling me the latest models can, you've still got to dig it out of the ground. So that's still creating the same issues for Indigenous people. Like, I just don't know why we would do that when we can have cheap, decentralised, renewable energy that's proven, that works. It's not the technology that's letting us down here. It's the policy and planning that has stopped us from actually making that work and getting it out in time.
Here in the front as well. Did you have a question? Yes, with the scarf. Yeah.
My name's Joanne. Is there any correlation in the lack of belief of the general population in religion? For example, a relation of mine was of a certain denomination who believed that these were the end times and Jesus was going to come and save us as per Revelations. Do you think that belief could be holding people back from believing in climate change?
So did you all hear the question? Yeah. Who'd like to take that one on?
You didn't hear it?
David.
I almost finished the pen. No, well,
I'm really happy to take that on. The question was, is religion diverting people from taking action on climate change? And you know Karl Marx's dictum that religion is the opiate of the masses. I think a new religion has taken over, which is very much diverting us from taking action, and it's materialism. And at the centre of it is the great God, growth. And if you don't bow down to growth, you are punished. And if we don't keep growth going, we're going to have dire consequences, our economy, our employment, our well-being. And it's a self-defeating religion, because on a finite planet we can't keep this going. And we have to use our rationality, our God-given sense, if you like, our brains, to understand this, that what this planet needs is us taking our guardianship as a matter of the prime urgency and our vision for the future. Yes, we do have politicians in high places who believe in the rapture, that there's going to be a destruction of the planet in which a selected few people will go to heaven. I'm a Presbyterian, I know all about this, and all the rest will go to hell. Look, it is codswallop. There will be no divine intervention. Yes, but I'm speaking about it now because I know this is being live streamed and will go to people who are troubled about it. But the fact is, we've got this brain to work it out for ourselves, and the onus is on our shoulders. And to put that off onto some other being is simply irresponsible.
So we have a question there and then in the middle. Yep. In the front, with the beard. Sorry. I know there's a lot of you with beards out there, but...
it is Melbourne after all.
It is Melbourne.
I'm the beard. I'm a pre-service teacher who's just done a teaching placement in a primary school where their only real access to media was BTN and Herald Sun Kids. My question is, what media outlets do you recommend me be teaching in a primary school setting?
Well, my first recommendation would be that every child needs to be taken out into a natural environment at least once a week. And hopefully every year they'll spend some time out under campus. That's the greatest teacher. That's the greatest lesson of all. This planet itself, let it speak for itself. That said, I think being exposed to the Herald Sun is a good thing, provided somebody's there to guide people through the pitfalls. And you know, start at the back and read forward, but spend most time in the comics, because there's greater truths in there than you'll find in the other pages. That said, there's The Guardian, there's the Saturday paper, there's Crikey, there's quite a lot of other worthwhile media options. They're just not printed. That's the problem. And well, I think most primary school kids aren't reading newspapers anyway. So take them to other places where they can find alternatives, and take them to the environmental news services. There are a couple of those which tell us about how the environmental indices are going. It's very important that they go across and read that at least once a week.
Can I just add to that question? So I did this in my first year of uni, but I actually think it would be a really good project for primary school kids. When I was studying the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history in Australia, and what had happened with colonialism, I'd just come from North Queensland, where native title was a new thing, and I was completely just ignorant of it. And what they did was they got us to actually collect news clippings from the main newspapers and just see how different the reporting was on the same issue. That would be an interesting thing to do with kids. The other thing is the movie 2040, that documentary movie, is really great for kids because it's focused on the positive. It doesn't sugarcoat the reality of it, but it says, here's some ways forward. This is what we can do. And yeah, 8 to 10-year-olds in particular, apparently they love it.
My 10-year-old loves Sean McAuliffe, so I'll just chuck that one in.
Maiysha, what about you? Do you read the newspapers?
I do. This is a really interesting topic because a lot of people in my generation actually don't read physical newspapers. Usually it's on social media, Instagram, Twitter, terribly enough, Snapchat as well. And a lot of that information on there isn't always true, and it ends up being fake news. So I think we come to a broader question is, how do we ensure that young people and a lot of other people who are thriving off technology, how do they receive accurate, truthful news that reflects what's going on in society? While there are challenges with using social media as a news outlet, there are some great positives. For example, the fires in the Amazon, that was all over social media. You couldn't deny it. Everyone's Instagram stories were just Amazon fires burning. I think there is a great potential within social media and technology utilising that for news. We've just got to be careful to make sure that we're filtering it properly, but we're not also censoring freedom of speech and all that. And I think that comes to a much broader debate than just climate change.
Thank you. There's a question in the middle towards the back here. Yes, you who had your hand up with the scarf on. Yep. Lots of scarves in this room as well.
Scarves
almost as many as beards.
Hello, my name is Coralie. My question is actually more for La Trobe University, but that can extend to the panelists. Is La Trobe going to declare a climate and ecological emergency? And maybe for the panelists, do you think that's something that is useful, or it's just like words, and if there's no action, it's kind of worthless?
Look, I'm happy to declare it on behalf of La Trobe.
If I can perhaps take the La Trobe question, it is a very active question at the moment for us. There's a number of us who are thinking very hard and very carefully about this, and thinking about not only the great imperative to want to do that, because it seems as if it's a good thing to do, but also to think about what are the potential risks? What does the language of emergency evoke? Is that what we want to evoke? is the language of fear and sort of threat the best way to initiate change? Of course, the language, that's not to deny that we are in a crisis. And so it's something that we're very much thinking about at the moment, and like a good university should, trying to do the intellectual work to look at the different sides and the different issues that it raises. But watch this space.
And I'm happy to give a less considered response in a sense. So I would say, look, climate emergency declarations matter because they are telling the truth. It's a simple expression of the state we are in. And normatively, it's extraordinarily powerful to just acknowledge that we are in a state of emergency. As we know, if we are unlucky enough to be in a building, on a train, in a plane, when there is emergency announced, it triggers a response. And really, I guess that's where the rubber hits the road, is once the emergency has been declared, the question is then, what is the plan to honour the declaration of emergency? Now, not every jurisdiction so far has followed through, but for example, in one of the US cities that has declared a climate emergency, they've now set up an Office of Mobilisation. And if we can have the truth-telling, the declaration, the mobilisation that follows with all creativity and all bravery and all love and all seeing it as the opportunity that it is and the vision of 2040 out there, well, let's just get on with it.
Yeah, that would be my challenge to La Trobe University. It's not just what are you going to put in place to support people if that is the thing. So not just, well, what does that mean for every department and what the university is doing, but also to put in place support around grieving and the psychological support. And we've got Psychologists for a Safe Climate, for example, to provide that support to people, because while we've talked a lot about panic and the urgency, I think what's shutting down, where people are hiding behind different kinds of beliefs that's stopping them from acknowledging this, I think that's an overwhelm reaction. So we've got to be better at supporting each other. So what's the practical action? It's almost like the first aid training, so when the emergency happens, we're ready for that. What are we putting in place? What are we investing in? But also the emotional side of it, and taking that time to let people deal with that.
That's exactly the kind of questions that we're having. What does this actually mean for us as a university, and what would we need to ensure that was in place? And I mean, whether we declare an emergency or not, we need to ensure those things are in place, because actually that's the reality of our lives, and that recognising the grief that is part of going forward in a state of climate change is a very real issue, I think, for all employers and for all communities.
I mean, it is the immensity of the thing that is before us, and we've already seen these unbelievable things in the last few years. Half of the coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef, 1 million dead animals in the river out at Barwon. I mean, there is only going to be more of this, and we have to find some way, some ability to simultaneously carry the grief of what we're losing and the truth of that, but also just hold on to that vision of the thing that it is possible to create, and that faith and that conviction by drawing on the best of us that we can win through. And doing those two things at the same time is not easy, but we can do this.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add quickly? For my generation, mental health is a huge issue. Pretty much all my close friends have suffered with mental illness, and a number of students that I know, both at my school, outside of school, and in a lot of clubs and extracurriculars I'm involved with, have turned to substance abuse. And for young people, that's very confronting. I know a girl within our organisation, School Strike for Climate. She came to me and she told me, I feel so helpless. The government's failing me, we're not getting anything done. So when La Trobe does declare a climate emergency, at its heart, mental health must be considered, especially because it's a place for young people, it's a place for us to grow, and making sure that we're looking after that really important part of our health is absolutely crucial.
Thanks, Maiysha.
I might add there, I think that as a former doctor, the worst thing we can do is suppress the truth that's in front of us. It is much better to have it out and also to take action. That's why our foundation has the motto, don't get depressed, get active. And, you know, in the wake of the convoy, where we've had all sorts of false political analyses made, but we accept those on our shoulders, we'll be taking a film of the convoy and a book about it, but more importantly, the reality of climate change and the options we're talking about here tonight, right through the Murray-Darling Basin in the last week of October, including hopefully to the city of Dubbo and to places like Brewarrina. We haven't yet quite charted where that will be. But far from being knocked back by the scoffing and the score, I was in Ballina quite recently, northern New South Wales. A big gentleman came up and said to me, "Are you Bob Brown?" I thought, here we go. Yes, he said, "Well, I just wanted, I own a cattle station in southwest Queensland. I just want you to know I totally support that convoy." And I said to him, "Well, sir, I think you might be telling me a fibber." And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I read in the Courier Mail that nobody in Queensland supported this convoy, and I've just found you as one." And he rolled his eyes. And, you know, this is people experiencing the end of their hopes, their lives, their well-being, as they've known it, everything. And it's as if the big cities don't care. So we do have to be out there. I agree with Amanda on that, and we've got to be offering solutions. Well, the solutions are there. The renewable energy is there. Energy efficiency is there. But we've got to get off the greed and materialism wagon at the same. That's the big question confronting humanity on a finite planet, because you cannot have perpetual growth in exploitation of a finite system, and we're really challenged with using our intelligence to bring that back into place right now.
We've got a question on the edge there and then down here.
Hello, Rod's my name. I come from a farming background and I've been involved in health for the last 20 years. I've got a 14-year-old daughter who goes along to the climate demonstrations in the city and a 12-year-old son. You spoke about Tim Flannery, and Tim Flannery has always been offered positive solutions, so it's quite significant, I think, that he's come to a crux and said, you know, he's been quite new with them, but that's, you know, he's always been quite positive. I think what Bob was saying about, you know, activism, I think if we look at what's happening in Hong Kong at the moment, the sophisticated, intelligent way that they, you know, they're in a crisis, but they are being quite active. You know, we can talk about, you know, the rhetoric about what we can do, but activism is, it's come for a time where we've got to be active. So I'd like to, particularly with Bob, would you have, particularly with Adani and places, things like that, what things that we can actively do to address, rather than talk? We can talk about things, and that's good and well, and there's well-meaning people around here, but it's come to a point where we have to be more active and put more pressure on.
Well, if we've got time on our hands, we should go and join those folk who are blockading in the forests in Victoria or in the Tarkine, because the United Nations says the best way of the quickest, cheapest hedge against the onrush of the climate emergency is to protect what's left of our forests. And in Australia, we're not doing that. We're licensing the destruction of more. So there's a very quick and easy way if we've got time. And if we don't have time, give money to those who do. It takes quite a lot to have the communications, the transport, the media, and so on. And vote against anybody who's wanting to destroy one more tree of native forests in Australia.
Question down here.
Hi, my name is Erica and I'm actually from University of Melbourne, though I'm beginning to think maybe I should have gone to Latrobe.
You're welcome anytime, Erica.
I guess in the context of protest and radicalism, my question is, in the face of an existential threat and knowing that we are definitely going to die, how do you determine the extent of protest and what is politically and ethically justifiable? I know, Bob, you said you're against violence, but sometimes it's really tempting, so...
And you know, Mandela tried it and found that it was much better to be a peaceful revolutionary, and he got indicted for taking a violent action. It's a dilemma as old. It goes back to Christ and beyond that into the Greek philosophers, as far as recorded history is concerned. But as Martin Luther King and Thoreau and Gandhi and so many others have worked it out, you can't stop the tanks and the guns through violent confrontation. The state and the corporate sector's got the power there, but what they don't have is the moral suasion. And here we are confronted with this great moral dilemma of the climate emergency, and most people want action taken on it. All the polls show that in Australia, most people still want the Adani mine stopped. They want coal mining wound down, 80% plus. Australia Institute this last week in Australia want more action on climate change. And if we don't get it, we've got to take it ourselves, and each for their own when it comes to that. But it does mean getting out of our comfort zone. And we're all able to think about what to do. If it means on Saturdays going down to the Locals MP's office with a Stop Adani sign and just saying there for the morning, that's legitimate, that's fine, that's great. The next Saturday you'll find a few more people will join you. And look at what's coming up on Friday. Just fantastic, you know, just inspiring. So Greta decided instead of curling up in a ball of grief on her bed, she'd go and sit in front of the Swedish Parliament. And within 3 weeks, the youngsters at Castlemaine were following her lead and getting out to protest about it. Now look what's happened. There's more of this coming down the line. And let's hope we do get through to a rational rearrangement of human affairs so that we live with this planet instead of off it, using such phenomenal breakthrough brain power and moral suasion as we're going to see on Friday. And who doesn't want to be part of that on Friday?
Maiysha.
You touched a bit on radical action. For a lot of young people, especially as part of School Strike for Climate, this is something we talk about a lot. We want to be really careful with our actions, what they imply, what they mean, and how other people view them. Extinction Rebellion is an organisation I'm sure you've all heard of. And School Strike for Climate has been quite hesitant about a number of their actions. One of them was a couple of young people standing on ice blocks with nooses around their necks. And, you know, I'm sure you can understand the meaning. It's global warming, the ice blocks are melting, and we're going to die. Doom and gloom. But if you take that from someone else's perspective, someone who might be dealing with a really hard time or suffering from mental health problems, that can be very confronting and it can act as a trigger. We need to be really careful with the actions we take, what they mean and what they seem. Extinction Rebellion are doing an excellent job in what they're doing, but for someone like School Strike for Climate, with young people, we want to be careful with what we're saying because we see things differently from maybe what you adults do, and we can be quite sensitive to some other issues than you guys. And we think actions need to be meaningful. I think, especially for me, I don't speak on behalf of everyone, but I want my actions to have meaning. I don't just want to sit with a poster and have it to be meaningless. I want to have a conversation. For me, that's my action. For someone else, like Greta, that's striking outside Parliament, and that's absolutely valid. But we need to ensure that every action has meaning, and we have to consider how it's perceived by others and what implications it holds.
Can I just respond to that one just briefly too? So, I mean, for Greenpeace, we've obviously engaged in peaceful civil disobedience in all sorts of contexts all over the world for many years. Peace is hardwired into us, and it was there before the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior and the murder that occurred with that in New Zealand. But I actually want to come to the start of your question as well and witness that. the statement that we're all going to die. Well, I mean, as Kane said, we're all dead in the end, but I witness the sense of desperation that goes with that. And I think there's something really important at work here that we really need to collectively spend our energy on addressing. And it's that we need to guard against playing a part that has been cast for us, where we are just walking towards inevitable doom. Because that is not the only path. And it is not the path that is being taken on Friday, and it is not inevitable, and it is not preordained. Now, all around us, we are surrounded by what the medieval painters would have called memento mori, right? The signs of death, the skulls are there, and it doesn't look good. But the medieval painters also painted in the memento vivere, the statement that, and yet we live. Because people are wonderful and creative and motivated by love and care for each other. And when the storms break in Australia, the first instinct of every family and every community is one of kindness. And yes, we have inflicted wounds upon the earth, but great forests still stand. And yes, there are legions of species that are faced with extinction, but if they are given the chance, they will rebound. All of this is still possible. So let us not take this part that has been cast for us, but instead make flesh that which is still possible. Please.
Now we have time for one more question. I've been very conscious that most of the questions have come from the left side of the room. It's my left. So one question from my right, over here in the front. In the front, the second row, yeah.
Hello, my name is Alex. I'm a La Trobe engineering student. My question for the panel is, after energy, which we've heard a lot about tonight, agriculture is regarded as the second largest contributor to climate change, roughly equal with transportation. And to me, it seems like that's sort of the elephant in the room in a lot of discussions regarding climate change, perhaps the cow in the room. So I was wondering if we could hear from what the panel feel about in regards to how we could transition to a sustainable diet for our climate's health. Thank you.
Amanda, do you want to?
Yeah, that's a great one. And I actually think it's not just part of the problem, it's also a big part of the solution. And it starts like the whole system of agriculture. We actually had a webinar about this on Sunday about the food system and climate change. So it's, on the problem side, it starts with the clearing of the land, the fact that about 45% of all food produced actually goes to livestock, not to humans. And then the half that goes to humans actually is food waste before it gets to any consumers. So we've got some issue, and then there's the transportation of the food contributing to climate change. It's the fertilisers that we use because of the monocropping. So there's a lot of things that we need to address there in the way that we're actually, and how do we shift from, again, it's extractive, the agricultural models that have been set up, the big agro industry, and unfortunately they're gaining more control as farmers are retiring and selling off their farms. Because the average age of a farmer in Australia is 65, I think, or in their 60s. So we've got some land issues and some around that actually then impinge on the decisions that are made about those resources. So where do we go with that? And then there's also, there's a diet issue. So if we reduce our consumption of meat, and that's an interesting question because we actually had somebody on Sunday talking about non-animal protein. And we got to a really interesting point because it's like, great, there's alternatives for the people who really like meat, sort of still like meat, so we can just help them along in that journey. But it's also a big industry. And is that then just recreating the same kinds of problems that we've had before instead of actually changing our relationship to that? So I think it's one of those things in terms of the diet question. There's no silver bullet. As soon as somebody's saying this is the only way, I think we need to start questioning that. It's how do we have lots of options that are moving people wherever they're at in that change cycle, to move in the right direction. But even just reducing our meat, I don't know what the percentage is, but just by a small amount, if everyone just reduced their meat to actually what the healthy diet is, we'd be making a huge difference in that system. But we also need to start looking at local food systems. We need to start looking at how we're supporting local farmers. So there's lots of different parts to that question, but we also have all the solutions and answers around that. You know, we have community-supported agriculture. You do in Melbourne. What are we doing to support those things and actually cut through the duopoly in the supermarket chain, which is actually fueling a lot of that agro-industrial issues? Sorry, that felt a bit rambly. Did that make sense?
I'm afraid it is time that we have to wind up this evening's discussion. I think you'll all agree with me that we have here on our panel 4 incredibly inspiring, thoughtful and powerful leaders in the climate and environmental activism space who take their activism not only as an act of action but also as an act of thought, and that they're thinking about their role as activists and the change that they seek to see is really profound, and I've been really struck by that this evening. I've also been really struck by how much is happening, and you've talked about that a lot, Amanda and Bob and all of you, that much is happening that we don't know about. Obviously, there's much more that still needs to happen, and there's many, many challenges ahead of us. But one of the things that Greta Thunberg says is, it's not just a matter of hope, you have to act, and if you act, then hope comes. And I think we've seen that in evidence tonight, that's a common sentiment that you all share. Another thing that Greta says is you just need to do everything you can with everyone you can to change everything you can. I think on Friday we're going to have a massive meeting of people to take action, to speak truth, to claim the streets, to claim the people power, and to insist that our governments start to take this seriously. And as David, you said, if the governments aren't prepared, then at least they might be willing to follow. I'd like to thank all our speakers, to thank Rob Mann again for organising this whole series. I'd also like to... I'd like to draw your attention to the forthcoming events that La Trobe is organising, public events of this kind, a bold thinking series, Generational Divide, What Kind of Drinker Are You? Go along and find out, doesn't that sound fascinating? And then the next in this Ideas in Society program on the 30th of October, Do Trade Unions Help or Harm Our Economy and Society? That promises to be a very dynamic and engaging debate as well. Thank you again, and we'll see you on Friday.